The night Callum Hart told a room full of people that he had built everything from nothing. His wife Iris was standing 6 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water she hadn't touched, listening to every word. She didn't flinch, she didn't correct him. She just stood there in the pale gold light of the restaurant they had rented out for his 38th birthday, watching him work the room the way he always did. Loose-shouldered, chin up, one hand gesturing towards some invisible horizon only he could see. Honestly, he was saying to a man named Whitfield, one of his newer investors, "I just had a vision and I executed. Simple as that, you either have the instinct or you don't." Whitfield nodded. He was the kind of man who nodded a lot at other men who spoke with confidence. Iris took a small sip of her water. She had a very specific memory from 7 years ago. She was sitting at the kitchen table of the apartment she had been paying for, alone since she was 26, across from a man who had just told her that his third business idea, a craft spirits brand, was going to be different this time. He had said that with the eyes of someone who genuinely believed it, and she, because she loved him and because she was at her core, a person who believed in people, had said okay. She had said, "Let me look at the numbers." She had opened her laptop, run a projection model the way she did at work every single day, and she had said, "I can support this for 18 months. That's what I can give you, make it count." That was the first envelope. Not a literal envelope, just a quiet private accounting she had started keeping, a record of what she put in and what came back. She didn't do it out of suspicion. She did it because she was a financial analyst by training and by instinct, and numbers were how she understood the world. Callum's craft spirits brand lasted 11 months before he pivoted to a consulting firm that never found a single client. The consulting firm became a real estate venture that collapsed before it broke even. The real estate venture became a content studio, branded storytelling, he called it, that produced 2 projects in 3 years, both funded by a small business loan that Iris had co-signed because his credit history alone wouldn't qualify. She co-signed because she believed in him. She believed in him the way you believe in a house you are still in the middle of building, not because it is finished, but because you can see what it could be. The house never got finished. But nobody in that restaurant knew that. What Whitfield and the other guests knew was the version Callum had refined over years of telling it. The one where he identified an underserved market, leveraged strategic partnerships, built a brand from scratch. The one where we quietly disappeared from the sentence and I moved in to take up all the space. Iris had heard this version so many times she could have narrated it herself. She knew the pause he left before from scratch. She knew the way he tilted his head when he said instinct, like the word was something holy. She had been the instinct. She had been the strategy and the safety net and the patient capital that let him try again when everything fell apart. She had covered the mortgage on the house in Brentwood for the first 3 years while his income was inconsistent. She had taken a second consulting contract one winter, working weekends for 4 months straight, because the content studio needed an equipment upgrade and they didn't have the cash flow to absorb it. She had never asked to be acknowledged publicly. That wasn't what she wanted. She was a private person. She didn't need a speech. But there is a distance between not asking for credit and having your contribution erased so completely that even the person you love most stops seeing it. That distance had been growing for a long time, and somewhere in the last year, without any dramatic moment or loud argument, Iris had started to realize that she had crossed it. The thing that finally clarified everything was a podcast. It was a Tuesday in February and she was in her car outside a grocery store, engine running, because the interview she had pulled up while driving had another 12 minutes left, and she didn't want to stop listening. The podcast was called The Architecture of Success, and it featured founders and entrepreneurs talking about how they built their companies. Callum had been a guest the week before. She hadn't known about it until a colleague forwarded her the link with a message that just said, "Have you heard this?" She had not. She sat in the parking lot and listened to her husband describe the early days of the content studio as betting on himself. He talked about the sacrifices he had made, late nights, creative risk, putting his reputation on the line. The host asked if he had a support system. Callum said he had always been someone who moved independently. He said, "When you really believe in your vision, you find a way to resource it yourself." The interviewer said, "I love that. Self-made start to finish." Callum said, "That's the only way I know." Iris sat in the car for a long time after the episode ended. She thought about the co-signed loan. She thought about the 4 weekends in a row she had worked to buy equipment that now sat in a studio with her husband's name on the door. She thought about the mortgage, the business insurance she had added to her policy, the tax returns where she had listed herself as a supporting contributor to keep their combined filing clean. She thought about what resourced it himself meant when the resource had a name and a social security number and had been getting up at 6 every morning for 7 years to make sure the numbers held. And then, quietly, sitting in a grocery store parking lot on a Tuesday in February. Something shifted in Iris' heart. Not anger, not quite. Something more like clarity. She did not say anything to Callum that night, or the next day or the week after. This was something people who knew Iris well understood about her. She did not react, she assessed. It was the same quality that made her exceptional at her job, the ability to look at a situation without the noise of her own feelings clouding the data, to figure out what was actually true before deciding what to do about it. What was actually true, she began to understand over the following weeks, was this. The mortgage on the house in Brentwood was in her name. She had bought the property before they were married and refinanced it afterward, but the original equity was hers. She had never transferred full joint ownership, something her attorney had gently recommended against, and that Callum had never pushed for, because he preferred not to think about paperwork. The business loan for the content studio had been co-signed by her, but the structure of the loan meant that she was the primary borrower, and he was the guarantor. A detail that had been explained at closing and immediately forgotten by everyone except Iris, who forgot nothing. The equipment lease for the studio's production gear, cameras, sound equipment, editing hardware, was in her name. She had arranged it through a vendor she had a professional relationship with. Her name was on the contract, her card was on the account. The studio space itself was leased through an LLC that she had formed when they were setting up the business, because she understood tax structure and he did not. He was the sole member on paper, which had seemed like a clean way to give him ownership. What neither of them had revisited since was that the LLC's operating agreement contained a clause, standard but consequential, that required the primary financial backer's written consent for any major operational decision. She was the primary financial backer. She had been the primary financial backer for 7 years. She didn't tell him any of this. She just went home every night, made dinner, listened to him talk about a new project he was developing, and took very careful, very private notes. The birthday party was in April. By then, Iris had spoken with her attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Cecily, who had been her family's lawyer since Iris was in college, and she understood exactly what she held and exactly what it meant. She also understood something that Cecily had said near the end of their second meeting, which was, "The goal here isn't to punish. The goal is to stop subsidizing something that isn't working and never was." Iris had thought about that for a long time. She decided Cecily was right. At the party, she stood in the gold light and listened to Callum tell Whitfield about vision and instinct and building from nothing, and she felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication, not satisfaction exactly. More like a very old, very quiet grief for the version of this story she had wanted it to be. The one where they built something real together, where his success was their success, where the word "we" meant what it was supposed to mean. That version wasn't coming. She had known it for a while. She was just finishing the last paperwork on accepting it. She set her glass down on a nearby table untouched and went to find her coat. The following Monday, Cecily filed the first set of notices. The equipment lease was the first thing. Because the lease was in Iris's name, and the billing cycle was coming up, she notified the vendor that she would not be renewing. The vendor, per the contract terms, was required to issue a 30-day notice to all parties, and then arrange for return of the equipment if payment was not assumed by another signatory. Callum was not a signatory. The second thing was the LLC. Iris exercised her rights under the operating agreement and formally requested a review of the studio's financial management, a process that, under the terms both of them had signed, gave her significant oversight authority. This was not aggressive. It was procedural. But procedural, when the underlying structure has been ignored for years, can be very powerful. The third thing was the loan. She contacted the lending institution and clarified her status as primary borrower. She discussed restructuring options that would remove the studio's assets from the loan's collateral pool and return them to a position that reflected her actual exposure. This, too, was not dramatic, it was administrative. It was the kind of thing that happens when someone who has been keeping careful records for 7 years finally opens the folder. She didn't call Callum to tell him any of this. She didn't send a message. She had spent years doing the quiet work of supporting a life that had stopped including her in its story. She felt no obligation to narrate her exit in real time. On a Wednesday in the second week of May, Callum arrived at his studio at 8:30 in the morning to find 2 men in polo shirts with a vendor's logo on the chest waiting outside with a clipboard and a truck. He called Iris at 9:14. She let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9:22. She was in a meeting and declined the call. The voicemail he left was long and confused. He said there had been a mistake. He said there must have been some kind of miscommunication. He said the equipment was essential to a project he was in the middle of, that this was going to create serious problems, that she needed to call him back right away. She listened to the voicemail during her lunch break. She sat at her desk with her salad and played it twice, not because she needed to hear it again but because she was, as always, thorough. Then she opened her laptop and sent Cecily a message that said, "Received." No response necessary from my end for now. Please proceed with the LLC review. Cecily replied within the hour, already in motion. It took another 2 weeks for the full picture to become clear to Callum. He figured out the loan restructuring when he received a letter from the lender. He figured out the LLC clause when Cecily's office contacted him formally to initiate the financial review. He figured out the extent of what he hadn't been paying attention to the same way most people figure out the extent of what they haven't been paying attention to. Slowly, then all at once. He asked to meet with Iris. She agreed to a single meeting at a neutral location, with Cecily present. He came in with the energy of someone who was prepared to explain something, to identify the misunderstanding and correct it, to be calm and reasonable and find a resolution. He sat across the table from his wife and her attorney and looked, for the first time in a long time, genuinely uncertain. He said, "I don't understand why you're doing this." Iris looked at him for a moment, not coldly, not warmly, with the same clear, steady attention she brought to every conversation that mattered. She said, "Yes, you do." He said, "We can talk about this, we can work through whatever this is." She said, "Callum, I have been working through it for 7 years." He said, "I never asked you to." She said, "I know you didn't. That's the part that took me a long time to understand." He looked at her like he was waiting for her to say something else. She didn't. Cecily slid a document across the table. She said, "This outlines the proposed division of financial obligations and the timeline for restructuring. If you have questions, I'm happy to walk through it." Callum looked at the document. He looked at Iris. He looked at the document again. He said, "The studio." Cecily said, "The studio's lease expires in August. You're welcome to negotiate a new lease in your name with the landlord directly. The operating agreement review will be complete within 30 days. He said, "What am I supposed to do with 30 days, Cecily's?" "Mr. Hart, that's outside the scope of what we're here to discuss." Iris picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window. She didn't take pleasure in the mechanics of it. That was the thing people on the outside might not understand. There was no satisfaction in watching the structure come apart, because she had cared about that structure once. She had built it with her own hands and her own money and her own very specific, very methodical belief in someone who had stopped deserving it a long time before she was ready to admit it. What she felt, mostly in those weeks, was tired. And underneath the tired, something she hadn't felt in years: space. Room to breathe. The sensation of carrying something very heavy for a very long time and then setting it down and discovering that your hands still work. She found a therapist, a practical woman named Dr. Aguilar, who didn't deal in platitudes and gave her direct feedback delivered with calm. She called her sister in Portland and told her the full story for the first time, and her sister said, "Iris, I have been waiting for this call for 4 years." And they talked for 2 hours and cried a little and laughed more than that. She took a long weekend in June and drove up the coast by herself and stayed in a small inn where she knew nobody and nobody knew her. And she ordered room service and sat on a balcony watching the Pacific in the gray morning light and felt, for the first time in she couldn't remember how long, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wasn't sure what came next. She was 39 years old. She had her work, which she was genuinely good at and which paid her well. She had her house, which she had bought herself and which had her name on the deed. She had the quiet, specific confidence of someone who had looked at a very complicated situation and understood every line of it. Callum would be fine. Not immediately, not without difficulty, but eventually. He was resourceful in the ways that people who have always been supported are resourceful. He would find another arrangement, another person willing to believe in the vision, another room full of people to tell about instinct and sacrifice and building from nothing. She wished him no harm. She just wasn't going to be the foundation anymore. The content studio released a post on its social media in late June, announcing a relaunch under new leadership, as though it had ever been launched properly in the first place. Iris saw it because a mutual friend sent it to her with a question mark. She looked at it for a moment, then put her phone face down on the desk and went back to the quarterly report she was finishing. The podcast episode was still up. Self-made, start to finish. She had not asked for it to be taken down, had not contacted the host, had not done anything to rewrite the public record. That wasn't the point. The point had never been the story he told. The point was the story she had finally stopped telling herself. A few weeks after the meeting with Cecily, a woman Iris had worked with years ago, someone who had gone through her own version of a similar reckoning, sent her a message. It said, "I heard you were going through something. I just want you to know that the other side of it is real. It exists. You're going to get there." Iris read the message 3 times. Then she wrote back, "Thank you, I think I'm already there." The house in Brentwood was quiet now in a way it hadn't been in years. She had repainted the study a deep sage green, a color she had wanted since they moved in, but that Callum had vetoed in favor of white because he thought it would be better for resale. She wasn't thinking about resale. She was thinking about the color she actually wanted on the walls of the room where she spent her mornings. She had a succulent in the window that her sister had shipped from Portland. She had a bookshelf she had reorganized entirely, removing the business books that had always been more his than hers, and filling the space with things she actually wanted to read. She had, for the first time in a long time, a desk that was entirely her own. No half-finished pitch decks, no unmarked chords, no presence of a project she was quietly subsidizing. She sat there one morning in July, coffee in hand, looking at the light coming through the window and the sage-green wall, and the small, particular order of a life that had finally become entirely hers. She had not built from nothing. She had never needed to. She had been the foundation all along, and she had finally quietly returned to herself.